Hi, good evening and welcome. Thank you all for braving it out in the rain to come out to this program tonight. My name is Nisreen and I am the Education Programs Manager here at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs. I am super excited to welcome everyone who is joining us, both in our beautiful building on the Embarcadero in San Francisco and online. Tonight's program is a part of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Civics Initiative, Creating Citizens, building on foundational values of civility, mutual respect, across divides and informed action. Creating Citizens engages youth and adults in meaningful civil dialogue about the issues of our day so that we can all become active, informed participants in our shared democracy. We are also grateful to the Correct Foundation for their generous support of Creating Citizens, and thank you to iCivics for also being a co-creator in this program tonight. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We are recording this program for video and audio, so we would appreciate it for those of you who are in the room to please silence your cell phones, watches, and anything else that might make noise. We encourage you to ask questions of our speakers. If you are watching on YouTube, you can post your comments online, and we will have our staff taking notes of them and providing them to our moderator. And if you are in the room with us today, there's question cards around the room. We can also add pencils, and so write down your questions, and we'll also have staff collecting them as well. Our moderator for this evening is Rachel Myrow. She is the senior editor at KQED Silicon Valley News Desk, reporting on topics like what big tech sees in President Trump, California's many AI bills, and the lost sons of San Francisco. You can hear her on NPR, The World, WBUR's Here and Now, and the BBC. She also guest hosts for KQED's Forum. Before all this, she also hosted the California's Report for 7+ years. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Myrow, who will introduce our speakers for this evening.
All righty then. Thank you, Nisreen. And thanks you to all the people who have joined us tonight for this special event brought to you by Creating Citizens and the Commonwealth Club. So good to be back here. I'm Rachel Myrow. I'll be pleased to be your moderator for this very timely, if not urgent, conversation. As AI transforms governance, civic engagement, and education, this conversation should help us understand how the use of artificial intelligence is influencing our democracy, and hopefully how informed, engaged citizens can meet this moment. Today, we bring together experts in AI, civics, democracy building, and youth organizing to discuss the shared responsibilities across sectors to foster an informed and active citizenry in an AI-driven world. Together in this room and online, we're hoping today's insights will help us equip the generations coming after us to navigate the bumpy times ahead. I'll start now with Jerry Kaplan, who invented several groundbreaking technologies, including handheld tablet computers, online auctions, and electronic musical instruments. 2 of 4 Silicon Valley startups he co-founded became publicly traded companies. He teaches about the social and economic impact of artificial intelligence at Stanford, and he's a serial author. His latest book is Generative Artificial Intelligence: What Everyone Needs to Know. Ace Parsi is the director of coalition engagement at iCivics, a nonprofit that provides educational online games and lesson plans to promote civics education and encourage students to become active citizens. Before that, he was Director of Innovation at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, Director of Deeper Learning at the National Association of State Boards of Education, and Director of Policy at the National Service Learning Partnership. Sanvi Arora is a public policy and computer science student at UC Berkeley and is the executive director of the Youth Power Project, a youth-led organization that empowers young people under 25 to inform public policy. Her work focuses on how AI systems, data privacy, and digital surveillance impact healthcare access, criminal justice, and civic participation. Well, Jerry, I thought we'd start with you because you've been here before the Commonwealth Club, explaining that we have to get away from thinking and talking about generative artificial intelligence as if it was a crazy religious concept. I think those are your words. Why is that? Why? Break it down for us.
All right, I'll give you my 60-second stump speech on AI. Most people think of AI as an attempt to build increasingly intelligent machines that might rival human brains and ultimately exceed our intelligence, rise up, decide they don't need us and wipe us out. That people worry about this so-called runaway AI and superintelligence.
Not going to happen? Or?
It's all nonsense.
Okay.
The right way to think about it, or a much better framing, I should say, thinking about it, is that artificial intelligence is a remarkable advance in automation. And like previous waves of automation, it will have predictable effects. It's certainly going to change the way we work. It's going to make people a lot more productive. It will have some negative effects in the short run, putting people out of work, but it will also make us much wealthier overall as a society. And it will make us more, as I say, more productive. And so if we think about it from that perspective, it's true that we can build these systems to be dangerous. But I think of that just like product liability. We need to make sure that the products that we release using the new waves of artificial intelligence operate safely, don't cause various kinds of problems. And all of that is something that can be done. And it's not magic. It's not some kind of creation of a new form of life. It's simply another tool, and a very powerful tool, that we're going to see do all kinds of amazing things in research, education, creative work. Many people in the room are probably getting more productive as the days go by from this technology. And I think it's going to have remarkable positive effects ultimately on the way we live and on the way we work.
Can I push on?
Yeah.
Because we were talking in the back, and I thought, like, oh my God, we're all going to agree on everything, and so like I'm just seizing on an opportunity where if we don't on that, because I do think what I hear in Jerry's assessment, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, is that this can help us be bigger, faster, stronger in some ways. But I think that part of what I'm concerned about in terms of the civic aspect of this is that bigger, faster, stronger may not be better or deeper. And so, like, for example, social media dramatically expanded our capability to communicate with many, many, many more people at a rate that would have been completely unimaginable when we had just 3 news stations or whatever it was. But at the same time, I think because the incentive structures weren't there, because there was more of an economic incentive, it really also brought about thinking about algorithms as ways that we further promulgate more extreme thinking. And I worry that every single one of these sorts of technologies that comes about, we think about it very much in technical context. Can it make us more productive? And we don't really think enough about it in terms of a social dynamic of this technology. So Nasreen and I, in terms of thinking about this technology, like this session, we emailed back and forth. I'd never worked with Nasreen before. We became friends throughout the process. But if I had thought that Nasreen was using AI to message me and then I was using AI to message her back, that would have immediately impacted the very quality of our relationship. Now, that's one human relationship. If you keep building that out to communities, to estates, to a nation, you could see that having really, really detrimental impacts on our democratic institutions. And so part of this is also thinking about what are those outcomes that we can't foresee right now in the same way that we didn't for social media, and how do we educate young people in light of them?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I was giving the economic argument,
Yeah.
and not necessarily the social argument. The truth is that the technology is going to disintermediate communication between people. In fact, even it's going to substitute in some cases. Let me give you a real example. I think there's going to be a huge industry we might call personal companions. Mm-hmm. People want to come home at the end of the day. They want to relax. They'll pour themselves a drink. Instead of turning on the TV, which many people do now, they're going to have a chatbot that knows them well, gives them good advice, they can complain to, it's endlessly patient. And what are you going to do in that situation? Rather than interacting with people and having to deal with the true human, the characteristics of human interaction, you're going to be substituting machine. I call this emotional pornography, just to be clear.
That's a great phrase. I got to steal that.
Everybody steals my work. You're more than welcome.
Well, I do want to sort of bring us back to the general topic of the evening,
We'll go on all night. We don't-
which is the way that that GAI is already beginning to evolve our political landscape, and possibly help turbocharge the destruction of democracy, small d, not just in this society. Sanvi, let's get you into this conversation. Before the last presidential election, I'll admit I believed one of the biggest threats to the integrity of the process was going to be deep fakes. I'm sure those of us in the audience are familiar with the idea of video and audio that encourages us to believe a candidate said or did something they did or didn't. But now I think I have that wrong, that the biggest problem was not actually AI last fall, but social media platforms that have trained so many people over so many years to distrust legacy media, to gobble up dishonest propaganda. And AI provided effective tools to make that happen more frequently. But it's not so much that it created the problem, if you get what I'm saying.
No, I get what you're saying. I think that on the topic of deepfakes, I think that we're going to see those coming up more and more in future elections. And I think that with young people, we talk a lot about how at least people in my generation have grown up online, so we can understand or distinguish between what's fake and real. But I think that's going to become more and more difficult, especially for younger generations that have grown up completely online, where I think the benchmark for a lot of folks in my generation, where I spent the first 12 years of my life offline, and then got a phone when I was in high school, so I still remember what life was like before I had a phone. I think a lot of young kids right now who are online at such an early age, it's harder to remember okay, what's non-digital stuff, what is the grass outside, what are the trees, what's going on, and I think that that'll make it harder to have this kind of this agency over understanding okay, real versus fake, how do we actually understand the difference between a deep fake and a deep real, a real thing. And so I think that's one thing. But on the topic of social media, I think absolutely, I think social media, the way that some of the algorithms have been designed, obviously, it's just the way that these algorithms are trying to recommend content. You have to classify the content, and the easiest content to classify, or the easiest way to simplify a narrative into a binary idea, is to look at what's most polarizing about it and figure out okay, how do you put that argument in a box? And sometimes with traditional social media, the nuance in classifying information is lost. The nuance under the information is lost in trying to classify it. So I think AI can be helpful in maybe figuring out new ways to build recommendation systems for social media platforms that's more nuanced, although I'm not sure where the technology is on that. But I do think that, back to the actual point, I do think that, with a lot of young people moving to social media, it's not, that there has been an idea that social media narratives have become the real narratives of populations or communities. And I think what we really saw in this last election was this idea that one generation, by being online, votes a specific way, or one generation is going to resonate, this entire generation is going to resonate with this one idea or this one meme that's going to then win the election for this group of people, right? And that didn't happen, and that's because sometimes we fail to recognize that social media is not representative of our entire democracy. It's not representative of our entire institution. So that being said, I do think that sometimes the fact that social media is, it rewards certain kinds of ideologies, or not even certain kinds of ideologies, but certain kinds of extremities, a level of extremity in your ideology or the way that you're portraying something. I think that definitely creates a lot of room for distrust in civic institutions because you're bombarded with so much information, but it seems you're in an echo chamber that only rewards polarization. And I think that that can be very harmful, because how do you kind of achieve a balance? First of all, what is a balanced perspective? But how exactly do we create thoughtful civil discourse online when you don't even have anyone to receive that because of the way these systems are built?
Do you think that distrust leads digital natives especially to be more sophisticated, better able to catch out the deep fakes, the misinformation, the disinformation? Or do you think it's the other way around, that because they are so distrustful now, that
they don't believe anything, and therefore they're more gullible to an engaging argument?
I think that like I think that there's certain I think that certain groups of young people, or not even young people, just people who are very online, people say chronically online, like that, like certain groups of folks are very perceptive to this idea. Okay, we have to keep in mind that like not everything online is like real, and like we have to check our facts. Like we gotta do like we gotta get our tertiary sources or whatever, and make sure that we're checking the footnotes. Like there are definitely people that are very diligent about that, and a lot of technology, like a lot of social media platforms have created community capabilities to do that. Like X has like community notes to like help people like be more who are interested in having a more diligent like civic experience online, like have that experience. But I also think that there's another group of people that are very well versed in how to, I guess, like weaponize like AI, weaponize deepfakes to reach that those populations online that might not necessarily like be as diligent about verifying information, and that's I think another thing that we've seen. Like I have gotten to a point where I think that like we have capabilities to create like synthetic information, or like generative AI has gotten to a point where I think there's like I've seen videos that I thought were real, and then I'm like, wait, that's AI, and I think that's what's scary too. Mm-hmm. It's like as the technology advances, like will those distinctions be as perceptive as they are? Because obviously nascent forms of technology are different than when they're fully adapted. And the way that telephones have become so integrated into our daily life, like to that extent, will synthetic content become so integrated into our daily life? Will we be used to seeing synthetic information so much that it'll be harder and harder to
just
tell?
take it for granted. It's the new normal. Jerry, did I see you? Yeah.
Look, one thing I would like to caution us in thinking about this field is we can't say, well, this is the effect that AI is going to have. The truth is it's going to, just like dealing with people, there are good people and there are bad people. And there's some of these sources you're going to trust and others that you're not going to trust. And everybody will understand 10 years from now that these systems can be used to create very persuasive content. And the thing you need to train your students to think about is, well, do I believe that's an accurate and reliable source? Because you'll also have the same technology on the other side working for you. You'll have your own personal representative, and you can say, is that true what that person said? So it's going to be a very different kind of thing. I think that in the future, when we want the most objective, knowledgeable, and insightful information, we're going to turn to machines, not to people. So you're going to have some form of that which you're going to have to trust, and you can use that to help moderate or mediate between you and the AIs on the other side that are trying to fool you and cheat you.
Well, I have to say, I've been spending a lot of time playing with ChatGPT in particular, right? Because, I can't choose not to, in a way. I have to identify what it is that I'm working with. And, quite often I'll get into arguments with it. I'll be like, no, that's actually not correct. Or I'll click on the links, show you receipts that, now we're asking a lot of these sort of chatbots or large learning models to deliver us. You click on the link, and it's not even about the thing that it's purporting to be about. It doesn't even cover the same topic area. I've had ChatGPT, disagree with me when I correct it, and then I'll say, for the benefit of people who come after me with the same question, here are my receipts, right? Which is just, I don't know, another way of saying, like, I'm waiting for that moment to get there when it stops hallucinating and delivering the hallucinations with such confidence.
You do realize you're just talking to yourself when you do that. It doesn't have any of that context that goes back into the system, except
but isn't it? It's collecting that information.
Not really.
No,
it's not being. Those systems right now are trained monolithically.
Yeah,
and they're not being updated based on what everybody's talking to them. That's one of the major advances we're going to see in the next. And there's a whole bunch of research to solve exactly the problems you're talking about. The hallucination problems, things like chain of thought reasoning, retrieval augmented, whatever it is, generation.
You're asking the wrong person. Yeah.
All of those things, because
Yeah.
these are known flaws, obviously. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of work going on. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to fix those, but you're not going to deal with a system you can't trust.
Yeah.
I think well, two things. One, even at Jerry's school, at Stanford, which is one of the best universities in the country, Dr. Sam Weinberg has research that highlights even Stanford students in terms of how prone they are to misinformation. In fact, I mean, Stanford students are just as prone to it as the rest of us. So I think that's like one thing that to note with that. So like, this notion of digital nativism versus digital literate are very different concepts. So that's
Yeah.
And then, but the thing that worries me, I think, about in this conversation is that, so I'm a first generation immigrant. I immigrated from Iran when I was 8. So I've lived in 2 countries in my life. And in one of them, this nuance that we're talking about actually matters, because for a democracy to work, you have to have trust in the system, right? You have to have trust that when you communicate with your leaders, they are listening to you. You have to have trust that when you vote, your vote counts just as much as anybody else. When that trust gets violated or shaken, the entire democratic experiment is put at further risk. And so one of the things that I think that we need to be mindful of is that this isn't just the technology that's going to create like very, very cute cat pictures, which it can. But it's also this technology, like how will it affect our relationships with each other? So one of the things I worry about in terms of, Jerry, the point you made in terms of your individual assistance is that democracy and society and that social cohesion works because we need each other. And so when you start fraying those bonds, that will ultimately affect those relationships and those relationships amongst ourselves in democracy. What I worry about is that this technology is rolling really, really fast. We haven't really prepared young people, or any of us really for that matter, to really navigate it, not only as a productive worker, but as a community member and a civic actor. And I worry that, the go fast and break things could break things. And so we need to be really mindful, and this is why I think K-12 civic education is such a core element of how we get this right, is that we really need to be incorporate this into how young people are prepared to engage with this technology as a civic actor, not just as an economic actor.
So, Ace, the other day I saw a headline. An associate professor in Canada pieced together a database of roughly 300 ways the federal government there is using AI to help predict the outcome of tax cases, sort temporary visa applications, promote diversity in hiring. And this associate professor's argument was there needs to be far more public debate about what kinds of systems should be in use in Canada. But on this side of the border, I think it's fair to say that Americans have little to no idea what's in use, what's impacting us. And this was true even before Trump started a second term.
Mm-hmm. I think so. You all have a one-pager that's a summary of a report that we released around education, social cohesion, and democracy. And one of those core elements that we highlighted in there is the ethical implications of this work. And we put it in there because young people today in classrooms are going to be facing the consequences of the actions that we make in boardrooms in Silicon Valley. The question for me is, as we roll out these technologies, is it what would be wise is to incorporate young people into those conversations at the very outset. We're releasing this sort of technology into the classroom. What are the positive implications and what are the challenging implications? Let's debate that within our class. That itself, that is an amazing civics lesson. And we can also, bring other sorts of historical realities from the invention of the printing press to personal computers and all these different things, and thinking about how all these technologies were used for bad and good, and engage young people in those conversations right now. What I worry is that decisions that are getting made at school boards, at state boards of education, legislatures, are not incorporating those dimensions, and they're not engaging young people in the conversation. And I think they need to.
So here's a question for all three of you. You don't have to be an extremist. You don't have to be a MAGA fan to be exasperated with sclerotic government institutions at all levels, that many of them have not served the public well for decades, if not lifetimes, generations. How do we restore public trust in democratic, and that's with a small d, institutions, at the very time that, many of them are now wholesale engaged in using AI to shake things up, but again, in ways that are not transparent to the public?
You first, yeah.
Well, the first thing to understand is what's gone wrong here is we're being governed by liars, and that's not good. So the real question is we need to have some shared idea of truth. I can just go policy by policy and talk about the idiocy that's going on. Taking a hatchet to government is a big mistake. The idea that it's somehow out of control and full of liberals who aren't really doing their jobs is ridiculous. All you need to do is look at one simple fact. If you look at currently there are about 3 million civilian employees in the U.S. government, and that is the same number that it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago. The economy has grown by I think 5 times since then, and the population has grown by 75%. That government is efficient. Now, it may not be great, and you can find lots of problems, but the idea of just taking a hatchet to it is not making it any more efficient. It's simply going to reduce services for people. That's just a single example of the idiocy that's currently going on. I can go down topic by topic and break this down. We're sending troops to the southern border. Okay, I agree we don't want an open border. Everybody agrees on that. But the problem was solved even before these people took office. It was down 90%, and now it's going down even further. Why are we wasting all that money? It's just performative and for show. So the first thing we need to do is that people need to understand what's true and what's not true, and how their money is being wasted by these fools on the kinds of programs and the undermining the fundamental pillars that have made our democracy work, such as an independent judiciary. Okay, so how's that got to do with AI? Well, the truth is we need AI systems that can identify these kinds of falsehoods and bring them to our attention. And we need to train our students and our children to be able to say, hey, is that true or is that not true? Because it's an arms race, and we've got tools, and the other side's got tools as well. We need to be able to use them in an effective way. And AI is a potentially very powerful tool for ferreting out truth and telling the difference between lies and falsehoods and actual facts. So I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic on this particular subject. I'm just saying that all is not lost. We're simply moving. The arms race is a probably pretty good example. We're stepping up the game in terms of how we engage with our government and the ways in which we can make it work.
So you see GAI as a tool that members of the public can use to ferret out fraud, ferret out corruption,
Absolutely.
ferret out lies.
Yeah, and make the government more efficient, et cetera. But what's going to happen? You've got these people in office right now doing these foolish and destructive things. It's going to have the foolish and destructive consequences. People will see that when the price of eggs go up, when they can't make a reservation at Yosemite, when they call the IRS and there's nobody to answer the phone, to give them their refund. I mean, what's going to happen is things have to get bad enough that it becomes personal for them, and then we all get to vote. We'll get to vote for a different regime that actually has a sensible program.
Sanvi, Ace, which of you wants to tackle the question?
Do you mind repeating the question?
Jerry went big.
No,
All right.
I came up
So
with
you don't have to be an extremist to be exasperated with sclerotic government institutions that haven't served the public well for decades. How can we restore public trust in democratic small d institutions?
I mean, I think you mentioned it, I think, earlier. I mean, we've been talking a little bit about transparency, but I think that there needs to be a better job of demystifying, what happens behind closed doors in civic institutions. I think that, this idea that like we have like public open elections or whatever, and like candidates can say things and then do different things. I think like that has eroded a lot of trust. And I think also the language that like our government institutions use to characterize the experiences of communities is like creates a lot of distrust as well. Like I think that we need to accept the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to being an American citizen or an American. Like there's no one-size-fits-all experience, there's no one-size-fits-all livelihood, like, and there's no one-size-fits-all service to fix these issues. You know, when people are in need of support, like there's no one program or solution that's going to help everybody. And I think recognizing that those differences are what create a strong sense of cohesion in a community is something that we've lost, unfortunately, in the last, I don't even know how long, but a while. So I think that's a place to start. And I think that amongst like in a world that's where a lot of civil discourse happens online, and where like negativity, or not even negativity, but like this idea of criticism, but criticism that's not constructive, like is more heavily rewarded than the kind of constructive criticism that creates like flourishing democracies. I think that has accelerated this kind of deterioration in trust, because it makes people feel like, hey, like first of all, you're able to receive so much information about what's wrong all at once, you know, and I think that creates just an overwhelming sense of pessimism to engage in civic institutions in the first place. But the second is that I think that like just this inability to you know really figure out in this barrage of information what is true and what isn't, I think also creates this sense of like proclivity to disengage. I mean, you get burnt out like just doing that work and doing that labor. And I think there needs to be like a little bit of integration in like education systems too. You know, like I think that there has been this move in education with the onset of, or not the onset, but like with how widespread AI has become, to like teach like young people how to be human beings without AI. But at the end of the day, like everyone's using AI, and AI is happening. Like it's what's going on. And I think that like this doesn't, sometimes that mindset of like abstaining from like the status quo with technology doesn't equip people to develop healthy relationships with that technology. It just pushes you to delay developing a relationship with technology. So I think that there needs to be we need to understand like what the role of education is in creating those healthy relationships, and use that to inform how like, you know, young people understand that they're being socialized online. I think one other piece, just really quickly, I yap a lot, but one other piece that I've been thinking a lot about is like how sometimes there's different extremes of dependence on technology. And I think sometimes when there's an over-dependence on technology, like a concern that I have is that like, how are we going to be able to create how are we going to be able to empower citizens to create their own viewpoints? Like, especially if AI is like accumulating information, or like is trained on information that is like publicly available, like, or, you know, what data is it trained on? Like, how is that information then feeding the perspectives of young people? It's different than a Google search, right? Like AI is different than a Google search. It's oftentimes combining a lot of different sources and creating opinions, or like sort of presenting opinions, you know? And I think that like that creates this interesting idea that like, will this move people like ideologically to the center, or will it move people to the extremes? Because depending on the platform that you use, will you be trained to view things differently? And how are we actually like utilizing education and like educational environments to train young people to not depend on technology to form ideas, but more use it to accelerate their ability to intake information?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's both points. Made some really good points. I think part of what like I'll build on Sanvi's is that notion of distrust. I think people, you know, I live in West Virginia. We're very distrusting of government in West Virginia. But I think part of it is that having that knowledge of how institutions work. I think a lot of people don't. So they think that there's some sort of game that they don't understand, and they don't understand what's happening. The part of that I think is really important to build in media literacy and algorithmic literacy. Like, what is it? What's happening? How is this getting the information? How is it giving that sort of opinion? And I think absent that, there is just a general feeling of distrust. And distrust works fine when you have an authoritarian regime because they can't do anything. But like when you're talking about a democracy, again, like that distrust can be very corrosive. The second thing I think is the issue of knowledge, skills, dispositions, and behavior. So young people need an understanding of how these institutions work. I know that, I have a friend who's a former Republican member of Congress in Florida, and one of the things that he noted was that, that sometimes young people will come into the meetings incredibly articulate, incredibly cogent, and they would ask things like, well, how can you change the lunch menu? And the member would be like, well, I don't have any authority on that. But for a young person, that might be really like frustrating because I made this great argument. So if you don't have an understanding of how institutions work, where I take my views, all that, that's going to be problematic for democracy. And the other challenge, I think, as Jerry noted, is that the institutions have not kept up with the changes in our society, but we do live in now a culture that demands instant gratification. And so how do you navigate an instant gratification culture around systems that are designed to work slowly? And how do we do that in this? I think that's going to be a really important question for how we move forward as a democracy, is as systems don't move fast enough, and people don't know how the systems work, there's going to be a risk of breeding greater distrust. And what does that mean for our future?
If I can make a point on this, since I'm talking to two education experts, if you go back and you look at the history of secondary education in the U.S., the reason it was started was due to automation. It was because people who were working on farms, they didn't need that education. Once automation hit the farms and there was far, far less work, the government realized that we needed to retrain the entire population to do knowledge work, to learn reading and writing and arithmetic and all of that. But they also understood something important, and this was very much a part of it. They wanted to have public schools precisely because it forced people from all walks of life, rich, poor, whatever, to be together and to form some kind of a sense of community or to understand the range of opinions and ideas that were there. So I think what we need is a new public town square. We have to figure out a way to reinvent it in such a way that people can see what the other points of view are and not be protected from them or prevented from them in such a way that they can begin to form some kind of consensus, because that's the essence of democracy.
I would say that, building on that, there's an imperative here to think about how education has transformed over time. So I would go back to Horace Mann, Jefferson, that there's some element of why we educate people in a public square, because we want them to have an impact on that public square in our democracy. So I'd say that there's a lot of things that have undercut that over time. So, in the 1950s, with the launch of Sputnik, we really focused as a nation on science education as a means of survival. In the 1980s, with the Nation at Risk report, we really focused on the economic imperatives of education. You saw in the early 2000s with No Child Left Behind, we focused that economic imperative around reading and math. And recently, with the culture wars, it's become a fraught space to teach civics, history. And it's exactly at this time that we really need it most. So I think that this is, Abraham Lincoln has this quote in his Lyceum address that, if we are going to go down as a society, it's going to be basically an act of suicide. It's not going to be by some sort of external threat. And that is what we're at right now, that if we are going to continue to survive and thrive as a democratic society, we need to be able to prepare young people to exactly disagree with each other and challenge each other and have different viewpoints and know where they come from, rather than right now. I think one of the challenges could be that AI gives you your views. AI writes your report. AI tells you what you think in that sort of way. So I think it's incredibly important right now to build those skills as civic skills, not just employment skills.
Ace, I think that today we're suffering from an electronic tragedy of the commons. And what we need to do is to figure out how to stop that problem and create a really productive discussion that can take place in the broader society. And it's quite plausible that the new AI technology could be applied in some positive ways.
Or negative. I mean,
no.
And I think these are like tangible I think we got to stop talking about this like the sun's coming up and like, we have no control over the fact that the sun is coming up.
Right.
These are decisions that we're making, and these are decisions that we as citizens make. This is decisions that our policymakers make. This is not an inevitable, like that this is going to be positive or negative. It's just a function of the decisions that we're making right now.
It strikes me that what we're saying collectively here is that technology amplifies whatever its attention is focused on. So if what you have is a chaos of the commons, the technology just amplifies the chaos.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another thing that's important to note is that it's like a double-edged sword, and I think that like that's what we've been talking about this whole time. It's like, hey, like there have been so many benefits with the use of technology when it comes to like advancing or democratizing communication, right? Or like democratizing access to information. But then I think one thing that you've mentioned at the beginning was like, hey, we don't have as many small newspapers. Like there's a centralization in like the news space. Like people are just getting their news and their media from like singular sources now, and we don't have as like, these smaller newspapers are losing out. Like they don't have clientele, they don't have readers anymore. And I think that one other thing to mention is that like in the work that we do with YPP, like a lot of our work is focused on bringing young people into policy spaces. And one of the biggest like reasons for distrust is this idea of not seeing someone like you or someone who resembles you in spaces that like you think are supposed to serve you. So when we talk about democracy, like a lot of young kids are like, oh, that's not for me. Like, oh yeah, sure, I have the right to vote, but like that's not for me. Like, oh, going to my state capital, that's not for me. Like, and even like just recognizing the fact that like democratic institutions, while they're slow to adopt technology, when they do, it's really beneficial. During the pandemic, the state legislature started doing things online, and suddenly the amount of like democratic participation from people who weren't able to travel to Sacramento skyrocketed. And then when they realized that they couldn't actually like hold that kind of capacity, they couldn't hear that many people's voices, so they had to like get rid of like virtual public comment again. And that just shows that like, hey, technology, like sometimes our institutions aren't even ready to receive the automation that technology can provide or the efficiency that it can provide, even though it can be very democratic. And so I think that like, and that's another side of that argument is that, hey, it benefits people who, thrive in the status quo and who resist change to not want to adopt these technologies that could lead to change. So I think including that kind of perspective is really important to recognizing that like, hey, like technology, like yes, from like a civic mindset, like when we're talking about community engagement, can be really beneficial and can be really harmful, but also from like a governance perspective, it can be beneficial, but also whose perspective are we considering when we're talking about benefit?
Let me be very specific to just throw out an idea so people can get a sense of how AI could be used in this kind of a way. Imagine that we had a bipartisan government-provided, carefully vetted AI system that everybody could go talk to and give them their opinion. And it talked to everybody. It calls every single person in the United States who's willing to talk to it and has a conversation. What are you mad about? What don't you like? And then it produces a summary, a report, which everybody gets a chance to look at. Now, as long as we can believe that it's doing that in an objective and reasonable way, because it can be done. The question is, can we trust that process? Imagine how effective that could be in helping people to understand what do people think? How should we be solving our problems? How many people do or do not understand the facts about a situation? We can use the technology in this way. It's part of its power is its ability to boil down to, I'm losing my word here, but to coalesce all that information into a
to make
digestible
transparent to the society as a whole.
Sure.
What's really on people's minds, as opposed to seen through the sort of distorted prism of our
the self-interested, distorted prism, exactly.
Yeah.
If I could get online with some kind of product like that I trusted, a GAI New York Times, if you will, that is committed to objective and real answers, and I said, what do people really think about this subject? And how many people are there that are really eating dogs in Springfield, Missouri, or whatever it was? I would find that an extremely valuable tool for spreading truth, for providing consensus, and for supporting democracy.
Actually, there's
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's a pilot program, I think, in some states to do that, like to create like models where states can like, I actually, don't quote me on this. This might be misinformation, but I swear I heard this.
Show your receipts.
We're like 40 minutes into so about time to go with
the sources trust me. But I think what was I saying? Oh yeah, I think there needs to be. I think that it could be really cool to see. And what I've heard is that there have been efforts to create pilot programs where like states can solicit like very granular feedback from like a population seeking about a specific topic, and they can, instead of it being like a feedback survey if you seek Medicare, it's like instead it's like, hey, let's use AI to like do a more nuanced qualitative kind of poll of the population and get some like real answers and real narrative feedback. There's also like a movement towards like, I think it was built off this idea that like you can do research on social media narratives and like scrape a bunch of data from the internet and be like, what are people saying? Like, what are the themes? Like, I think that's what they're trying to do, but I think it's really cool, and I think that's.
I think.
I'll also say, because we do have just a few
Yeah.
more minutes before I turn to your questions
audience.
from the audience.
Yeah.
And I did want to get this question out to all three of you just after mentioning, check out, run a Google search or a search of your choice on the interesting democratic experiments happening in Ireland and Taiwan, where they are experimenting with more ways to let the public will, at the very least, be known, if not acted upon. But before we go to the listener questions, what are you telling your students, Jerry, at Stanford about how to be in the driver's seat as opposed to the passenger seat as we careen towards this bright future?
It's funny. That's a topic I really haven't broached because at Stanford, that's generally not a problem.
Yeah.
What I tell them about is think about the effects of your actions on other people, on society. Don't just think about yourself. This is one of the themes that I actually cover, and oddly enough, in my AI course. I talk about this to some degree, where you have to think about where do you want to be in 50 years. Don't just think about you want to be sitting by a pool, drinking tequila sunrises or something, but how are you going to help to make society a better place, and how are your actions going to inform that? Because the people that I teach at Stanford are generally the people who are going to be able to make those changes. I grew up kind of in the venture community, a startup community, and the general attitude is an individual really can make a difference. And so that's an idea that people in class really need to understand. They don't feel like they're just being buffeted around, and Stanford's a bad example for you.
What I would say, I think that part of it is, again, we sometimes hold the elite college educated to some sort of standard, but again, the research shows that they're no better than the rest of us in terms of getting misinformation I think that the points both of you raise are really interesting, but they're predicated on an educated, engaged citizenry who knows their rights, responsibilities, and how the system works.
That's your job.
That's why I'm saying this is why it should be a rebirth for the urgency of civics education right now, because absent that, let's look at not just the trees of opportunity here, but the whole forest. What could happen is also AI could put much more misinformation and distrust into whatever that AI system is. Like you mentioned the New York Times, there are many people in this country who don't trust the New York Times for whatever reason. And so I think part of that is that trust in institutions has to be based on an understanding of those institutions, the development of those skills to be able to interrogate those institutions and come up with really educated opinion. I don't think that that's quite there yet. And so if we had the super beneficial AI that you're talking about, Jerry, I'm not completely convinced that people are in a position to be able to really leverage it without that sort of civics education.
But on the bright side, there are institutions that people really do trust. I trust Apple. Netflix, people trust it. I know it sounds funny, but that's not something you go, I don't believe that. They're trying to fool me. They're looking out. In some sense, they're trying to, for their own purposes, to act in your best interest. So it is possible to create. My only point is, it is possible to create institutions that do have trust. The U.S. government certainly used to be one of them, and the whole point of the New York Times is they publish things that they believe are true.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm not arguing with that point, but I think it is that institutions, even I think Apple or tech companies, people can, in the same way that they think about the government as a black box, they can think about those things as a black box. Mm-hmm. Unless you understand what these sorts of algorithms and things are doing and how they relate with our relationship, you're going to have a large swath of the population that is going to be distrustful. Now, can they be taught and prepared with those knowledge, skills, dispositions, and behaviors to understand the institutions and know how to engage with them? Yes. But do we have an education system right now that's designed towards developing those capacities? I would argue not.
Well, we need to teach critical thinking and civic values. And
Absolutely.
That's just mother and apple pie, as they say.
I would love that, to be the case. We need more mothers and more apple pies.
Apple pie, right. Mom, can I have an apple pie?
Well, why don't we head into the questions now? For Jerry, who has the interests to boil these truth-telling systems? To build these truth-telling systems.
Let's
Like,
boil
that
them too.
doesn't make any sense. All right. What? So this is an interesting question. It's not just who has the interest, but who has the credibility for the public, right? I kind of wonder whether we're not trying to reinvent the wheel by saying, well, can't be government, well, can't be news media, well, can't be schools. At a certain point, what is it I also think it can't just be companies, brands.
Well, I think that's true. You need some institution that doesn't have somebody else's self-interest at heart. It's not Elon Musk. He's never going to do this, and he can't do it. We need another Walter Cronkite. There are people in history, in American culture, who have been trusted. Many American presidents were known were respected by the rest of the world because they were known to tell the truth. And that has been crushed recently, unfortunately. But that was a very important part of America's soft power. We could be looked on as as a country that you could trust to stick to its values. And so I don't think it's impossible for us to have such people. They're there. They're out there. We just need to figure out how to get them to rise up.
Re-employ them.
And to take employment
Yeah.
and to take control back of the government. Just vote them in.
The statement was made that we need each other. And the worry is that AI-based personal assistants may interfere with that. What are models for how AI could help people reach out to each other?
I think that there are definitely models of that sort of connection. I think we've mentioned some of those in terms of deliberations. There's, I know that there's the Close Up Foundation, for example, and the Stanford Center for Deliberative Democracy are doing incredible work in those areas. The question to me isn't, one, can these things happen? I think that they can. The question is, which one will outpace the other? Will the negative outpace the positive? And that's not a foregone conclusion. Those are the decisions of people here in this room, not only to engage with your elected officials, but to engage with the products that you engage that you purchase. As consumers, I think we have that responsibility to share with the Apples and these companies what it is that we would want. And those are also themselves like civic capacity. So I'm not a doomsday person, and I'm not utopian in this. I think that the story of this is being written right now, and it will be written by people who care enough to hold their leaders accountable to a system that makes sense for them. Whether that happens or not, I don't know, but I think that it's incumbent on everybody in this room and on the stage to be able to make that happen.
I also think that, I will give an example. UC Irvine just created Zot GPT, and because they're Zot, but so they created Zot GPT, which is like in Chat GPT, but that's like built in the environment of UC Irvine. And what it does, it helps students, they can type in and be like, where can I get counseling on this campus? And they press enter, and this service goes through all the information through UC Irvine, pulls up the top 10 services that students can reach out to according to what they're putting in, right? And I think that's a great example of where we can utilize AI to increase utilization for services that fall under this category of needing each other, you know? Like, there's a lot of lack of awareness, sometimes navigating these institutions and systems. It's really tough to figure out like what's out there. There's so much out there. How do I know what I need? And one really simple way that I see a lot of like people, especially I do a lot of work in the mental health space, like a lot of people in the mental health space, like utilizing AI is to just synthesize all of that information in a way that's really easily accessible. And I think like universities that have moved towards like this model of like creating like little mini GPTs, like I think Berkeley's trying to do Berkeley GPT. I don't even know. There's so many things happening. But like, again, don't want to be spreading misinformation, but during this panel about misinformation. But I think that what was I even saying? Oh yeah, the move toward the move towards doing this has actually increased like utilization in these services that otherwise were not being utilized. We're being underutilized. Like we're putting in investments, we're investing in these services. No one knows what they are. I think that's a great like space for AI to make a huge splash in terms of increasing engagement with things that will help people be better people.
Mm-hmm. Let's assume that we are not going back to a shared truth defined by academia, government institutions, etc. How can we live together without shared facts, and how can we use AI to help us get there?
You know, I about 17 years ago, I used to work at an elementary school here in the Bay Area, Fair Oaks Community School in Redwood City. And I haven't been here in the Bay Area in over 10 years. And I wanted to, and the elementary school is no longer around, actually. Like it got consolidated. Anyway, I went and looked at some of my old emails from a teacher that I worked with. And he said that, you know, he had a bad day and we were emailing back and forth. And he said that I can give my kids wings, but what I need to give them is roots. And so that's been something that's really stuck in my mind the last few hours, this kind of connection of wings and roots. Wings are those opportunities that can help unlock your potential with abilities, knowledge, all these sorts of things. Roots is the opportunity to go deeper. And that's the human relationship aspect of this that I feel like we could lose if we are just counting on the AI to give us those answers and not, you know, and that AI, you know, like my wife and I joke about this, like, you know, an AI partner would have many less disagreements than my wife and I do, but I love my wife and I would never love an AI partner. And so I think that getting out of the convenience of this sort of AI moment and also deepening our relationships with each other, I think it's going to be really important. I think that's the key part of what I want, like nurses, doctors, educators, to be really engaging in that depth of root building so that our young people are deeply rooted to relationships, to our society more broadly. And I worry that right now in this sort of bigger, faster, stronger zeitgeist, that we could be losing that. And I want not only educators, I want young people to have those skills, but because, you know, we don't prioritize that civic purpose of education, we don't also invest in the professional development of our educators to really navigate this transition. So at a time that we're disinvesting in a lot of our public institutions, I think it's imperative for us as citizens to advocate for a public investment in our people to be able to navigate it, to navigate these changes. And I don't think we are right now. I hope that we can.
It sounds like you're calling for a fundamentally analog commitment to widespread emotional, psychological, social maturity that, I don't know, it doesn't seem like we have in abundance right now.
But I wouldn't say it, like, I think that there are schools and districts in the same way that they've banned like social media that will say that I want to ban AI. And I don't think that does a service to our young people because that's the society that they're going to. So I'm not, I can sometimes be confused for a lot and I am in some parts of my life, but I don't think that that's the answer. I think that we need to evaluate those sorts of human relationships and deepening as we incorporate AI into that. And that is an important civic work that we need to do as a society and an education system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one thing I wanted to add like based on your idea of like building roots, like I think that sometimes like there's a focus on like when you're trying to like build behaviors to go to hammer those behaviors that you want to see in through institutions that people already don't like. So like people are like, we need to have trusted information. So we're going to release information through the government, specifically the branch that everyone hates and no one wants to listen to. And then you're like, that didn't do any good. It's like, oh my God, no one listened. It's like, oh yeah, I wonder why. But as soon as we see like the distribution of information through channels that people already turn to, like there's not a lack of trust in the world. There's a lack of trust in certain institutions. People still trust like other people. Like there's still an idea of trust. Like I think we can all define what trust means and who we trust in our lives. And like one thing that I think a lot about is like how there's a movement away from like peer-based distribution in this country. Like we don't rely on like these trusted messengers anymore. Like who is a trusted messenger? Like a faith-based institution, for example, or like the, like your local YMCA or like if your Boys and Girl Scouts, like these people that like, or not people, these institutions, these organizations that like people are already trusting, people have like fond, positive memories trusting, I think is really, really important. And I think a return to like creating spaces for that is a start to building a common ground around trust, because it allows us to recognize like, hey, like I had experiences that shape my values, and there are people who share those experiences whose values might be similar to mine because of that. And I think that's like, an interesting place to begin root building, and also begin understanding what like this idea of civic really means. Like I've been talking to a lot of people in the civic space, and they're like, we don't want to call it the civic space anymore because civic is such an overused term, and it's like, what does it even mean anymore? And I think like really going and thinking about that is really, really important.
As an person who works for an organization called iCivics, I know we struggle with that. No, totally. We struggle with that as that question at times.
Jerry?
Maybe I could end on a kind of optimistic note, a hopeful note. One of the amazing things about generative AI technology is that these large language models have exquisite social senses. They are capable of understanding all kinds of social subtlety, and in particular, they have shown that they are capable of very valid and positive ethical judgments. Now, they don't always exhibit that, and you can prevent them from doing it. But the truth is that this technology is capable of making sure that people or informing people about the ethical dimensions and characteristics of what they do. And that's a very powerful thing. And if we can find ways to be able to bring that out in ways that people want to use it and care about it, I think that can make a very positive impact on the future.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us this evening, in person, online, of course, our speakers, Jerry, Ace, and Sanvi. To find out about Commonwealth Club programs and learn more about creating citizens, visit commonwealthclub.org and follow them on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I'm Rachel Myro, and this concludes our program. Have a wonderful evening.